Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master, Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Welcome to Window on the West, where we explore all the ages of Tolkien's Middle-earth. With your hosts, Jonathan Watson, Michael Grumbine, and Dan Coates.
Welcome to episode 24 of Window on the West. My name is Jonathan Watson. We are reading through the Silmarillion, and today we'll be going through chapter 18, the latter half of chapter 18, and I will be going through it with Dan Coates here to my left. Oh no, wait, it's Michael.
Oh yes,
my
beard.
Over to my left. He's here to my left, but to my right.
Michael will be playing the part of Dan in this episode.
That's right, and Dan is down below.
I was only like 2 minutes late, man.
Yeah, so say we all.
Yeah. It's good to have you guys here. It's good to see you again after a week of little discussion, but lots of reading. So,
Indeed.
We are going to jump right into it. We're going to skip All That Is Gold Does Not Glitter because I want to get right into this chapter, and we're going to discuss at the end C.S. Lewis's review or response to what folks were saying about The Two Towers and Return of the King. It's an article we mentioned last week, and I'll put a link below, but you can go ahead and check that out and discuss it. And it's something that we'll probably be discussing in our Discord channel, which you can access by becoming a patron. So if you go to theonering.com/patron for $4 a month, you can join us in our Discord. You get our extended podcast, which is another 20 to 30 minutes longer. And you get access to our live chats that we do once a month with all of us, as long as all of us can make it, and our patrons. So join us there at theonering.com/patron. $4 a month. First month is free. So let's jump into the latter half of chapter 18 of The Ruin of Beleriand with
Dan's Big Thought.
So since Michael will be playing the part of Dan today, I had a big thought. Having arrived before Dan for the first time in forever,
You took my spot.
I'm usurping his place for 1 week.
Mm-hmm.
So my big thought about this chapter was that what was interesting is the chapter, not only did we split it in halves in our podcast, but it seems to me appropriate that it can be split in half, because up to this point, the story of the Silmarillion, since the awakening of the elves, has been the power and the rise of the elves, all about the elves and their fall in the Kinslaying, the Noldor elves fall, but then their power and strength in Middle-earth. But here in this chapter marks the demarcation. It is the demarcation line for the fall of the elves, the beginning of the end, I should say, the fall of the elves, and then the rise of men. And this chapter, basically the second half of this chapter, which we're about to cover, is about the rise of men and how unknown and very surprisingly to both Morgoth and the elves, the men are able to hold in a number of key places in Middle-earth. They're able to hold off the forces of Morgoth and provide a bulwark against his armies, and in fact force a temporary peace. So the rise of men, the men's much vaunted weakness is not as apparent in this chapter, and instead Tolkien is leaning into the strength of men in the second half of this chapter. So that's my big thought.
Yeah, it occurred to me that is it that perhaps even not just the strength of men, but that Morgoth underestimated them. He didn't really hold to their actually being powerful enough to hold him back, because he was sowing discord. He was creating chaos, hopefully between all the different houses of men a long time ago, and to see that now that there's some unity between them, and unity between them and the elves was probably a surprise to him.
Maybe evil doesn't understand such things. Friendship is not a theme that evil tends to understand very well.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you also see men like the company of Bara here, that they just fight even though there's no hope. Like they just keep fighting. It's like I don't think he understands that, because you see several times in the Silmarillion that Morgoth surrenders and pleads for mercy. Oh, please don't, and he's willing to be taken captive. And he doesn't understand this band of men that they're just mortals and they're willing to keep fighting, even though he's going to kill them all. He's like, I don't care. I'm just going to keep fighting.
That's right. And I think the phrase was, we're talking about Beren here now, father of one of the most famous men in Middle-earth, who we will get to next chapter. But Beleriand would not flee from Dorthonion. To remind our readers, our listeners, Dorthonion is the region around the mountains south of Angband. So it's just been the whole fields in front of it and between Angband and Dorthonion have been laid waste in the Dagor Bragalach, and Dorthonion itself is being conquered. And so it says, but Beleriand would not flee from Dorthonion and remained contesting the land foot by foot with his enemies. Rather grim and impressively courageous way of stating how he fights. And in fact, he does in fact fight to the death slowly until he's down to only 12 men, I believe. And then we find out at the very end that in fact, even those 12, all of them die. Although we'll get more details about that next chapter. Except one.
Except one, an important one.
Very important
one. One thing you brought up a couple episodes ago, Dan, was that, elves have a hard time understanding death and the finality of it. And since elves don't understand it, does them going into battle, does it make them less likely to go into battle because death is so unknown to them, whereas death is it's a part of man, right? It's something that we all have to deal with. And so if you know you're going to die anyway at some point, does that make you more likely to defend things to the death in that way? Whereas in elves, all we see is like, if you have a great fire in you, that's when you're going to go to battle. But the other ones seem content. We're going to go ahead and found Gondolin instead of actually going into battle because I want to preserve. I want to just live. I don't accept death as something that's part of me. So I'm not going to go into battle and embrace it in a way.
Yeah. What's interesting to me regarding the death of elves versus the death of men is that, at least for the elves, they seem to understand where they go afterwards. When I die, I go to the Hall of Mandos. And I don't know if that comforts them or if that makes them afraid. I don't know what their reaction is to that. But for men, when they come into Middle-earth, they go, we have no idea what happens to us. Like, no one's told us. So I wonder, you would think that would have the opposite effect. Yeah. They would be less likely to go into battle or do things that would get them to get killed because they have no idea what happens. Whereas the elves at least have some kind of assurance, like, oh yeah, I know where I go.
Right.
But yeah, you're right though. It seems like the elves, they kind of hunker up into these secret cities and fortresses. And yeah, I think at the beginning of this chapter, it wasn't Fingolfin trying to rally everyone. Hey, let's all fight Morgoth together. And then most everybody says, nah, no thanks, we're good. We've got relative peace and we've got our kingdoms. We're okay. We don't need to fight.
Well, and I believe it specifically says that they weren't willing to bear the cost of the death that they knew would come if they sieged Angband. So the elves do indeed seem to value life tremendously, as one would expect if your life was unending. This would be a dear thing to lose, right? Would be a life immortal. So I can understand that. Nevertheless, they do seem to have more of a peace about where, like you're saying, Dan, where they end up. And even the fact that they're even allowed in many cases to exit the Halls of Mandos and live in Valinor afterwards, in a kind of resurrected form, I suppose. Although few are sent back to Middle-earth. But yeah, it's super interesting. And there's a reference to that difference in the way they understand time in this very second half of the chapter, right? Remember Hurin and Huor, who are taken by the eagles, saved from death by the eagles and taken to Gondolin. They're the first men to set foot in that city. And in their conversation with Turgon, the elven king of Gondolin, Turgon has heard about the fact that Angband has burst forth from the siege, but he won't send any troops because he deems that, well, there's still time for Gondolin to come forth in her might later on, and now is not the time. And we find out that he sends messengers to try to beseech the Valar too, unsuccessfully. But Huor and Hurin respond to him, and they say, "Hey, look." They basically say, "Hey, you may have immortal life, and so you may think about, yeah, I'll wait for a couple hundred years and then I'll fight Morgoth, but we don't have that luxury. So can we go now, please?" And and they have the loophole of the fact that they don't know the way to Gondolin. It can't even be tortured out of them because they flew there on an eagle. So there's no danger in them. Well, there's no danger of that specifically, although we do know that when they're let go, word of their of their strange escape and where they've been living comes to Morgoth through his spies. But so it's not all good. But anyway, it's interesting because there definitely is that difference between elven concept of time and even with regards to war, and then the human concept of time and war.
And it also makes me wonder, right? I've been thinking about it a lot. The whole idea of the length of an elven life and how Sauron uses treachery, uses distrust in order to sow seeds of that. And I think in a way, it's easier to do that with the elves. What he writes in this chapter is, "But ever the Noldor feared most the treachery of those of their own kin who had been thralls in Angband. For Morgoth used some of those for his evil purposes, and feigning to give them liberty, sent them abroad, but their wills were chained to his, and they strayed only back to come back to him again." Okay, so that's talking about how, it's sort of Stockholm syndrome in a way, right? That they'll go back to Morgoth after going back to their own people. But because the elves live so long, the amount of time that Morgoth has in order to sow the discontent and the distrust is huge. Whereas he doesn't quite have that in men. He can't take a man over 500 years and poison him with distrust of his kin, whereas he can with the elves. Maybe that's the thing too.
Yeah, that's a good point. It may be cowing them in or just conquering them seems to be more effective for him than sowing distrust. Speaking of Sauron, we had this thing a couple of episodes ago where we were just saying what our favorite lines. So I think what an entrance, man. Tolkien gives Sauron quite the narrative entrance into this story. So I got to read Sauron's entrance. And this is when the armies of Sauron have burst forth, rather Morgoth have burst forth, but they've been held back at the sources of the Sirion, including the Isle of Tol Sirion. And it says, I guess it's technically two sentences. "But at length, after the fall of Fingolfin, Sauron, greatest and most terrible of the servants of Morgoth, who in the Sindarin tongue was named Gorthaur, came against Orodreth." Remember, Orodreth is one of the sons of Finarfin, "the warden of the tower upon Tol Sirion. Sauron was become now a sorcerer of dreadful power, master of shadows and of phantoms, foul in wisdom, cruel in strength, misshaping what he touched, twisting what he ruled, lord of werewolves. His dominion was torment."
What a great, exactly as we saw in the Rings of Power.
Oh wait, his dominion was hairspray. I mean,
it's really interesting how he takes Minas Tirith by assault. And it's just like a dark cloud of fear fell on those who defended it, and they were driven out. It's almost like he didn't even need force of arms so much. It was just like they were just all totally fearful, and they ran away.
Exactly. And do we remember, this is as all things in Tolkien, right? What comes before also comes after in another form. So the second Minas Tirith in the Return of the King, Sauron initially with his ring wraiths almost takes the fortress by terror as well. It's only the presence of Gandalf that staves off the fear of the Nazgul, and his presence that stopped the Lord of the Nazgul. Or actually, the Witch King wasn't quite stopped by him. There would have been a wonderful battle that we would all love to have seen, but girl power intervened. So
but it's like you, jeez. But it's the fear that allows his orcs, because they're growing ever bolder, and just because he's able to put that fear out there, the way he puts it is, He is right, master of shadows and of phantoms, foul in wisdom, cruel in strength. But so that allows them to keep pushing and to keep pushing and to keep pushing until eventually the men push back, and the men with some of the elves too.
Right. For 2 years, the elves fought. Remember?
Yeah. Right. That's
and
right.
the men fought with them. So Morgoth does in fact take land. So if we go back to our map, what's different between this chapter and the previous chapters is now all of the lands of Dorthonion and the lands between the Ard Gollin, between Thangorodrim and Dorthonion, are now his, as well as the Fens of Sarek, all the way up to Ithol Sirion, and then he's taken down in the past Tol Sirion. So, and that's due to Sauron. So Sauron's the big hero from Morgoth's perspective, because he actually wins a major battle basically on his own power, or something similar. So between the dragons and the Dagor Bragollach and then his massive armies, and then the power of Sauron, Morgoth now has a chunk that he didn't have, a significant amount of land, and his armies are ranging down, and they would have ranged down further, but they're stopped by the Min in the forest of Brethil, and so his armies are pouring down through that pass, and that's where between the pass of Tol Sirion, the Isle of Tol Sirion, and that pass that it guards, and the river Tieglin. That area becomes this battleground where the men basically hold Morgoth there. Now the elves are also holding Morgoth up in Mithrim, but here it's the men that get the glory.
And just imagine if Turgon had been like, we're pretty powerful. We've risen to a lot of power. Maybe we'll just have a few guys come out here and assist, because they're right there. They're literally, like right here to do something.
Yep.
And they decide not to.
Well, Thingol could too from Doriath.
Thingol could too. Sure. You could
close enough anyway.
head right over there.
But no, the men have to, and it's those Haladin again, the second group of men, right?
You mean the people of Haleth, the patriarchy of Haleth? I mean, the woman. Yeah, no. They renamed the Haladin the people of Haleth because of the woman that guided them and kept them together and created their house, essentially.
Yes, that's right. I was just referencing, Tolkien actually calls it the deeds of the Haladin in this particular one. But yes, same people. And so yes, the patriarchy, ruled by a woman, has set up shop here in Brethil, and they fight off the armies of Sauron themselves, basically. Well, not all by themselves. So they do call upon the elves, or at least a force of elves that guards the border, the March Wardens. Now, for those of you that have read Lord of the Rings, then, of course, which is probably everybody listening to this, then in a precursor to Haldir, the March Warden of Lothlorien, we have Beleg Strongbow, March Warden of Doriath, and he leads a force of elves with axes, not your usual sort of picture of elves, perhaps, but elves.
And let's remember, why do they have axes? Because really, the dwarves came in and helped them make Menegroth.
Correct.
And so they were there, probably helping.
They have dwarven-styled weapons.
Yeah.
It's really the Noldor that are big into the swords. So we discover that the people of Doriath use, or at least some of the March Wardens use axes. So they helped the men of that region, and they successfully drive away the orcs and armies and hold them to that region, keeping Nargothrond safe and all of the lands southwest of Brethil.
Nargothrond, which is right down here, if you see it on our video, right down there. So, and I don't have it highlighted here, but Tolkien makes the point. Oh yeah, right here. They're after the Black Tide out of the north, after the March Warden, the chief March Warden, Beleg Strongbow, took a great strength of the Sindar armed with axes into Brethil here. The Black Tide out of the north was stemmed in that region, and the orcs dared not cross the Teiglin, the river right here that you mentioned, Michael, for many years after. The people of Haleth, the people of Haleth, mentioned it. They dwelt yet in watchful peace in the forests of Brethil, and behind their guard the kingdom of Nargothrond had respite and mustered its strength. So Nargothrond back here completely 100% fine. They didn't have to really like battle right now, even though Fingolfin was gone at this point. So there's a thing.
Well, not only do they not have the battle, but it says specifically Morgoth doesn't even know where Nargothrond is. So
that's right. Yeah, he doesn't know where it is yet.
So they have made so little headway, even though Sauron took Tolkien, they've made so little headway. He doesn't even know the location of Nargothrond.
This chapter is so much exposition without story in a way, right? Because you get Hurin and Huor, and if you've read through, like we all have now, the Silmarillion, you're like, oh, Hurin and Huor, oh man. But what I didn't realize is that Huor is 13. I didn't catch that in previous readings, how young he actually is when he goes to Gondolin with Hurin. And so these kids, they're kids essentially. I mean, they're at that point, they're men. They're fighting like men, but they're not exactly battle-hardened veterans that meet up with Turgon.
Did it ever say how much older Hurin is than Huor?
I'm not sure. I don't think it did, because
they're very young.
Yeah, he writes, they both went to battle with the orcs, even Huor, for he would not be restrained, though he was but 13 years old.
But Turgon likes them.
Mm-hmm.
So not only does he welcome them as his and care for them for a year as his own, as his family or his fellow elves, even though they're not elves, but he lets them go and lets them leave Gondolin on a technicality.
Yeah.
So you're not allowed to leave Gondolin once you arrive, but because they were saved by eagles, they plead that means they can't possibly betray the paths to Gondolin, which is true. They can't. They don't know how to get there. So Turgon, out of love, lets him go. And then at that point, we have this funny quote, this hilarious quote from Maeglin, if everyone remembers, the son of Eol, the Dark Elf, and Erithel, the White Lady. And Maeglin, who's there and bitter, says something that my bitter teenager says sometimes when she comes home from college. He's hilarious. He has basically it's this speech, this sort of stereotypical speech to the men who are about to leave, that how the kids nowadays have it so much easier than he had it back in his day, because back in his day the rules used to be tougher, and no one was, when they said that no one was allowed to leave, they meant no one was allowed to leave. And nowadays, you just people coming and going all over the place. So yeah. Anyway, Maeglin doing what he does best, which is being bitter.
Yeah, he said the king's.
When I was your age, bedtime was 8:00.
Exactly.
No.
Mom and Dad took it easy on you. Yeah.
Yeah, he says the king's grace is greater than you know, and the law has become less stern than aforetime, or else no choice would be given you but to abide here to your life's end.
I mean, sorry, that's a lot nicer way of saying.
Yeah.
Mommy and Daddy are a lot softer on you.
Yeah. So apparently they're just 3 years apart. So
okay, so he was 16 and 13 then.
Yeah, pretty young still.
Yeah.
And they were there for how long?
1 year.
1 year. Okay.
So then they come back, and everyone's like, "Where did you go for a year?" And they said, "We were saved by eagles." ... and everyone said, and the response of their father is funny. But Galdor said, "Did you then dwell a year in the wild, or did the eagles house you in their eyries? But you found food and fine raiment, and return as young princes, not as waifs of the wood." And Hurin answered, "Be content that we have returned, for only under an oath of silence was this permitted." Then Galdor questioned them no more, but he and many others guessed at the truth. And in time, the strange fortune of Hurin and Huor reached the ears of the servants of Morgoth.
Which means he knows who to go to get to Gondolin. Essentially, it's sort of like that windy path that the facts might take until they eventually reach a place they should not have gone.
Yes, and we see the heavy foreshadowing of the downfall of Gondolin. I mean, it's not even foreshadowing. Tolkien just says it straight out that and Turgon knows that the doom is coming, and so anyway, in the meantime, Morgoth tries different things. He pretends he feigns pity to men, and tries to win them to his side that way, saying that it's okay if you come and pay homage to me, then and admit that you were just under the sway of those evil elves, then all will be forgiven. And most of the men just rebuff him, and so he gets mad.
Yeah, except for, like he mentions, Morgoth was well content for this he had designed. The sons of Bor were faithful. They followed Maedhros and Maglar, whereas the sons of Ulfang, which is a great name, Ulfang. It's very Germanic to me. The Black were Ulfast and blah, 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 and they followed Caranthir and swore allegiance to him and proved faithless. So you do have the different houses, some that do still hew towards.
Now these are the
Morgoth.
swarthy men, though.
Oh, these are the swarthy men.
These
You're
are the
right.
fourth group of men
But
that
they're
we've.
still men.
They are indeed,
Yes.
and half of them are loyal and half of them are not.
Were there any disloyal men, like, and we're kind of getting out of this chapter, any disloyal men that Tolkien writes about that were not the fourth group? Were there any that they were just despairing men, but I don't think they were.
Right, they were despairing, and
They
it
weren't
does
traitors.
They
it
weren't
does
traitors,
talk
yeah.
about how some of them were deceived. Remember the false form of that dissenter, the dissenting men. So there were some men that left. I don't know. I don't think it says that they joined Morgoth here, but it does imply that they were spies.
Yeah.
There were some spies among
true.
them,
Just
just
like
like
there
there
were
were
elves.
spies among the elves, actually.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, like, what would those elves look like? Because they were just wandering now, right? They wouldn't die in the woods. They would just wander in their,
Yeah, that's odd, right?
like, they're outcasts.
How sad to be an orphaned elf, right? Because you're going to be an orphan forever, just like
yeah, that's
unending
brutal.
orphanage.
That's torture. Right. Therefore, if any of his captives escaped in truth and returned to their own people, they had little welcome and wandered alone, outlawed, and desperate. There's a great little story if we had a talented writer to come up with about an outlawed elf who could never find a home, who was actually still good. Anyway, I can see all these great stories in between the cracks of the Silmarillion sometimes that weren't made. And I'm sure Tolkien thought of too, and he couldn't get to it because he ran out of time.
I mean, I think that's his style. I don't even think he would think of this as a failure or an incompleteness. Like the way he writes, he just creates cracks for new
You're right.
stories.
You're right.
That's the way he works. His mind works by just like you have that list of the men that survived, the 12 in the Outlaws of Barahir, and Gorlim the Unhappy.
the best name yet.
It is the best name. It reminds me. I mean, we're going to find out why next chapter, but it reminds me of the Seven Dwarves Grumpy.
Yeah, Gorlim the Unhappy.
Gorlim the Grumpy.
Not to mention the most misogynist name that Tolkien has, which is Barahir's wife, Emeldir the Man-Hearted.
Emeldir the Man-Hearted, who saves her people by leading them through the mountains and out of great danger and fights.
Yeah.
All those fainting lilies or whatever of Tolkien's world who can't lift a sword. Oh wait, no, that's the opposite of the truth. So
I do like how for me reading this the first time, just Tolkien's style jumps out at me, especially in these kind of chapters where he's writing like he's a historian. And to him, like that, when he lists all the names of each individual person who's remaining of the House of Barahir, and how he writes like they were a desperate band that could not escape, and they would not yield, for their dwellings were destroyed, their wives and children captured, slain, or fled. From Hithlum there came neither news nor help, and Barahir and his men were hunted like wild beasts. And they retreated to the barren highland above the forest and wandered among the tarns and rocky moors of that region, furthest from the spies and spells of Morgoth. Their bed was the heather and their roof the cloudy sky. And I just love how, after he's writing like he's like writing a legend of, well, obviously he is, but like, that everyone knows the 12. It's almost like, like these are like the 12 disciples or something, not in a religious sense, but like these are the guys that you know, and it's just interesting to me that it's like he's coming down afterwards and writing about it. Oh yeah, everyone knows this,
Right. It reminded me. I couldn't help but think of Robin Hood and the Band of Merry Men, these outlaws, many of whom have names. I have to say, like that passage you read was brilliant, Dan, because I have to say, I was reading that and I was thinking, okay. So here is a group of 12 men that have suffered every loss that you can. They live a life bereft of hope. They're just desperate in the wilderness. Everything is gone. They're like, and they're just, their only future is to fight to the death. And among them, one of them was known as the Unhappy. So what do you have to do in that group of 12 men to be known as the unhappy one?
Yeah.
Like seriously, like this guy must have put Eeyore to shame, because that's just,
Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. Well, and there are only two of them that get descriptive titles. There's Gorlim the Unhappy and Hatholdir the Young.
right.
So, not sure what that means, but yeah.
So the final line of our chapter is about these men. In that time also the outlaws of Dorthonion were destroyed, as is told hereafter. And Beren, son of Berahir, alone escaping, came hardly into Doriath. That beautiful use of the word hardly, which most modern folk have no idea why they don't understand what that means. It means barely, but or with great strife or trouble.
Right. So he barely made it into Doriath to save himself because he was able to get into the girdle of Melian, essentially. Is that?
Yeah. Well, we're going to find it.
Yeah. We'll find out in the next chapter.
We're going to go into
Neldoreth and
details.
all that, and he gets into the. Anyway.
So this is Beren, son of Berahir, and it's interesting because Beren is, of course, one of the one half of Middle-earth's dynamic duo, and who here.
You can't dynamic duo.
You know what that comes from, right?
Batman and Robin.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think that Luthien is the Robin to Beren's Batman.
No, I think it's the other way around, actually.
I don't think Beren is the Luthien to Robin's.
You mean the Robin?
Oh my gosh! I don't think Beren is Robin to Luthien's Batman either. I just reject that completely.
My attempt to be pithy has failed. Utterly.
I've got to come up with a better analogy of characters than dynamic duo. Anyway.
But anyway, it was always cool to me that the ring of Berahir, father of Beren, ends up on Aragorn's finger in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And so there's that deep connection with both Eärendil, who we haven't met yet, and Berahir and Beren through him.
Yeah, well, that means that next week we are on to chapter 19, Beren and Luthien, which is a long chapter.
Long.
And so we're going to break it up, into 3 parts. So the first part we're going to read is the second hard break in the chapter, where it ends with, "But none betrayed their lord." So on my copy of the Silmarillion, that's about page 201, and it ends with, "But none betrayed their lord," and the next section will start with, "In the time when Sauron cast Beren into the pit." So next week, let's jump into that, because this is, even like, I think to the day we're recording this on Twitter, tweeted out what Tolkien wrote to his son right after his wife had died, and they were coming up with what to put on the gravestone. So he wrote to his son, probably Christopher, I'm guessing. I'm not sure who it is. Maybe it was his daughter. But in July 1972, he wrote, "I have at last got busy about Mummy's grave. The inscription I should like is Edith Marie Tolkien, 1889 to 1971, Luthien. Brief and jejune, except for Luthien, which says for me more than a multitude of words, for she was, and knew she was, my Luthien." So certainly this story is the one closest to Tolkien's heart. And he couldn't think of anything better to put on his wife's gravestone than the word Luthien.
In any lesser writer, that would be a sign of a paucity of creativity and intellect. That the mythical figure closest in his mind to his wife is of his own creation. But when you read the story of Beren and Luthien, and you begin to understand the echoes throughout all of Tolkien's work, I don't think it's arrogance at all, or paucity of imagination, of which no one should accuse Tolkien anyway. But
I agree. I think a lot of fans these days would put that on their gravestone, though, and that says a lot.
And that's true. Do you think that's a good idea?
No, I don't, because the depth of the meaning of that is, I think, lost on pretty much everybody except for Tolkien, who actually wrote it. I mean, he wrote Beren and Luthien, I think, while in World War II, World War One. I believe it was one of his incarnational stories for Middle Earth.
Yes, the first version of it. Yes.
Right. Yeah. And so this is what he experienced, what kept him alive, probably in a way, was coming back to his Luthien. So anyway, next week we'll jump into that. So this week, as we get into
If You Like Tolkien,
we're going to actually look at an article that Lewis wrote, C.S. Lewis, of course, who was a close friend of Tolkien for many, many years, that he wrote as he was reviewing The Two Towers and The Return of the King. And it's not really a review so much as it is a response to other reviews of The Two Towers. So I'll link to this article below. And this is just a cleaner copy here that you see up on the screen. It was written, what did I have it? It was in 1955, I believe, right after the publication of The Return of the King. And he starts off by talking about how he's annoyed, he's frustrated that people that people have claimed that Tolkien's characters are black or white, are good or evil. There is no nuance to them. And he separates the point that no, good and evil are black and white, but characters in his stories, in Tolkien, I mean, even down to Gollum, Boromir, Aragorn, Frodo, right? Good and evil is they do inhabit some of that gray ground in the middle between them, and that they're not all one or the other. They make decisions that are evil or are not good, right? Boromir clearly does that. Frodo clearly does that at some point. Aragorn is maybe he's the closest, like Faramir is probably the closest thing to not making any decision like that. But even then, there is is Faramir's decision to go into battle at the behest of his father, is that a good decision? Probably not. So even then, right, we don't have the black and white. Anyway, that was my first takeaway from this, because he writes, good and ill have not changed, right here at the end of the first paragraph. And then he writes, this is the basis of the whole Tolkienian world. Well, that's what I got out of the first part of it. There's other points to be made too. What do you guys think about that, and where do you want to go into this from here?
Yeah, if you're asking, like, where I'm coming from, it seems like that's a problem with the critic than it's a problem with Tolkien. That having a black and white, a good and evil, it seems like they're objecting to the premise that you can have good versus evil. Like they want everything to be gray, and they want all their characters to be gray and nihilistic. It doesn't really ultimately matter. What makes a story really interesting is if things don't matter. Like that seems to be their criticism. Like they just want things to all be gray.
Yeah. Or if there's an admixture of good and evil, if you're saying, and the argument that they make to try to steelman it a little bit, and this is a common literary argument, it is one of the hallmarks of the height of modernism, actually, and that is that their argument is real people have both evil and good in them. So when you reduce everyone to an orc or an Aragorn, then you are being simplistic in a way which is not reflective of reality. And so that would be maybe one of the ways I would put their steelman argument. But I agree with you, Dan. I think it is a problem with the reader. Interestingly, I approach it from two angles. One is I see in it the trend in literature, whereas prior to the 20th century, literature had no problem laying out for you good and evil. When you read Jane Austen, when you read Last of the Mohicans, when you read the great tales of the 19th century and the earlier folklore and fairy stories, you get an idea very clearly of what good and evil is. But then in the 20th century, we got too smart for that, and modernism took over and said, what we got to really do is hold the mirror up and recognize that the complexity of people, that everyone's good and evil. And that's a weakness because, let me fast forward to the end of my thought on that one, which is that nowadays, interestingly enough, we kind of see a resurgence where people are getting tired of the eternal gray and we like a little bit more good and evil, even if the critics don't admit it in film and literature. But I tie it to the second part of Lewis's review, and near the end, second to last paragraph. I don't know what it looks like in Jonathan's version, but if you scroll down from where you are, Jonathan, it begins with, "But why?" Some ask. Why, if you have a serious comment to make in the life of real men, must you do it by talking about a phantasmagoric never land of your own? Because, I take it, one of the main things the author wants to say is that the real life of men is that of mythical and heroic quality. So, to tie that back to what you were saying, I think that's a really important part of Lewis's critique, because he's pointing out myth is not so easily dismissed. That the deeds of real people, gray though they may be, can still have a mythical and heroic quality. And how do you show that in a story? By writing a myth. And that, which is what Tolkien did. And he showed the quality of people in the various and regardless of which race of people it is, they can all be show heroic and mythic qualities. And so that was one of my first takeaways, was that Lewis is here he knows what Tolkien's doing. He knows the importance of myth, as he himself had took a couple stabs at myth himself in different forms, and slightly more allegorical than Tolkien would have liked, perhaps. But
yeah, right.
Nevertheless, he recognizes the beauty and the goodness and the need for that, and what Tolkien's trying to do.
And he's even defending myth making in which there are archetypes, where you have characters that are light, that are good, that are on the side of good. I don't really understand the criticism that every character needs. You need to see the black in every character's soul in order for them to be interesting.
Or every character needs to be a reflection of what our world is like when it comes to that character. All of us clearly are not as good speakers as almost pretty much every character in a book. If people actually spoke as in books as we read them, then life would be intensely intense, right? We wouldn't be able to have like actual conversation. If literature reflected how we converse in everyday life, imagine how boring that would actually be, even not just our times, but in other times, right? So you have to do things, you have to make them more real, as he says. And not only is the writing more real and the reading and the conversations more real, because they mean more when they're written. They're supposed to, otherwise it wouldn't grab us. So do the characters. The characters have to be more real in the story, right? The characters are, the black and the white of them are aspirational, and doesn't mean that they're perfect. He writes, let's see, one can see the principle at work in his characterization of Aragorn. Much that in a realistic world would be done by characterization is here done simply by making the character elf or dwarf or hobbit. The imagined beings have their insides on the outside. They are visible souls, right? They're more real because they're visible souls. Like, and he goes into this in the next chapter where he talks about things being more real, like and the thing we mentioned last week, where your imagination, when you dip something in the story, you're creating a greater representation of who it actually is than just by representing it as if it was part of real life.
I love really that cloak. Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna point out that I love Lewis's pulling of a very philosophic point in the conversation between Éomer and Aragorn, where Éomer himself contrasts the green earth, which is the real in Lewis's example, with legends.
That's where, that's exactly the point I was trying to make. You're right here.
Exactly. Yeah. And Aragorn corrects him, saying, actually, the green earth itself is a mighty matter of legend. In other words, the real is legendary, sir.
Yes.
And so pay attention to it. And that's what Tolkien's doing with his whole book. He's saying the real in our lives is legendary. The people that may be gray, have black and white in them, nevertheless they do heroic things, and we can point that out.
It's very Chestertonian, that sense of wonder of the purpose of. It seems like for Lewis and maybe Tolkien is that the purpose of making a myth is to. I think C.S. Lewis has that line further down where he talks about the cloak or the veil of familiarity.
Yeah, that's my favorite line from this whole review, actually.
Yeah, we forget the wonder and the glory of being alive. And we're surrounded by all these day-to-day concerns and worries and routines, and we forget the glory of being alive. And I think he's saying that the value, there it is, the value of myth is that it takes all the things that we know and restores to them the rich significance which has been hidden by the veil of familiarity. And I love that line.
And that's what modernity does. It tries to make everything more familiar.
Yeah.
Which just veils it more.
Yeah.
That's right. And so, I mean, it can entertain you for a while. I think of, for example, the American version of epic myth, which is a little sad when you think about it this way, is comic books. So the American culture has the only epic myth that and what draws the young heart and mind to the superheroes as written is not their gaudy costumes, and it's not the hilarious comic book banter. That can keep audiences entertained for a few movies like Marvel did. Like, we're going to make these characters more familiar and relatable, so we'll make them banter back and forth like a real person. But they've missed out, and I think this is really true in the latest version, in the last 10 years of Marvel, they've really missed out on why we're really drawn to heroic stories. It's not because of the familiarity. It's because, in fact, it pulls away that familiarity and says, here is something worth noting. Here is something wonderful. Here is something heroic, and we want that. And the sentence right after you read was, "The child enjoys his cold meat, otherwise dull to him, by pretending it is buffalo, just killed with his own bow and arrow. And the child is wise." That's a beautiful statement, because I mean, it's not that we're like, no, but it's not buffalo. Anyone that comes in upon a child and does that should be slapped, because no one is going to pretend. The child is in no serious danger of really thinking that his cold meat is actually buffalo. He's doing something that brings the heroic and the wonderful into his life, and that should be celebrated.
Hey, you know what? I want to talk about this more, but we're going to do that in our extended podcast. We're going to, I think there are a few other points I think that we can talk about. One, about the war, about World War I, and the point that C.S. Lewis makes, that it makes it more real. His experience in the war makes the battles in this story in the Lord of the Rings reminded him of World War I as well. And then also the impermanence of victory, he also mentions. And I thought that was an interesting point that he made in this episode, or sorry, in this article as well. All right, so we're going to jump into that. Next week, again, we're going to do the first third of Beren and Luthien, chapter 19. We're going up through the second break, which is where "But none betrayed their lord." It ends with that. So we will see you next week. Don't forget that you can join the conversation with us on Discord at thewondering.com/patron. You can become a patron there. $4 a month. First month is free. So if you find the conversation completely boring and the extended podcast not worth it, then just cancel and you can move on. But I don't think you will. I find that I like it a lot. So,
this is why we keep doing it.
Yeah, indeed. All right, so we're going to leave you behind. If you want to listen on to our continued conversation, then join us there, thewondering.com/patron. So see everybody, and have a good week.
Bye, freeloaders.
All right. Bye-bye.